It is May 12th, 2026, and somewhere between a phone call that lasted 11 minutes and a military alert that has now been active for 72 hours, the ceasefire that was supposed to hold is hanging by the thinnest thread anyone in this region has seen in years. Two men on opposite sides of the most volatile military standoff on the planet spoke for 11 minutes, and when that call ended, nobody in either capital could say with certainty whether what they had was a ceasefire or simply a pause before the next strike. That is where the world is tonight. Not at war, not at peace. Suspended in the gap between a ceasefire that exists on paper and a military posture that tells a completely different story. Because while diplomats in Muscat and Islamabad are still exchanging proposals, while back channels are still technically open, while the language of negotiation is still being used in public statements from both sides, something else entirely is happening on the ground. Iran's military has gone to its highest alert level. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has repositioned assets across the Gulf. Fast attack craft are moving in patterns that American naval intelligence has not seen since the earliest days of the crisis. And the question that every defense ministry on the planet is asking tonight, the question that will determine whether the next 72 hours produce a breakthrough or a catastrophe, is this. Is Iran preparing to respond to the American and Israeli strikes with something that ends the ceasefire permanently? Or is the alert a performance, a signal designed to extract concessions at the negotiating table without actually pulling the trigger? Nobody knows the answer yet, and that uncertainty, that specific gap between military posture and political intention, is the most dangerous place on earth to be right now. Let us start with what we actually know, because in a crisis of this complexity, separating verified fact from speculation is the single most important analytical discipline. What we know is that Iran's armed forces, including both the conventional military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have been placed on their highest operational alert status. This is not a routine readiness measure. Iran has a graduated alert system, and the level it has now activated is one that Iranian military commanders have historically reserved for periods when they believe military conflict is either imminent or in active progress. The last time Iran activated this level of alert was during the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. Before that, it was during the final stages of the Iran-Iraq War. The historical company this alert level keeps tells you something important about how Iranian military planners are reading the current situation. They are not treating this as a manageable escalation that can be absorbed without a fundamental change in operational posture. They are treating it as a potential threshold moment. What we also know is that the IRGC naval forces in the Gulf have repositioned assets in ways that American satellite imagery and naval intelligence have tracked with close attention. Fast attack craft, the small high-speed vessels that the IRGC has spent decades developing as its primary asymmetric naval capability against larger American surface combatants, have moved from their normal patrol patterns into configurations that American naval planners recognize as pre-engagement positioning. This does not mean an attack is imminent. Military repositioning in a crisis is standard operational procedure and serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It prepares options. It signals resolve. It improves tactical positioning in case a decision to act is made. And it creates uncertainty in the adversary's planning calculus, which is itself a form of leverage in a negotiating environment. But it also means that the gap between a ceasefire that is technically still holding and a kinetic exchange that ends it has narrowed in the past 48 hours in ways that are measurable and concerning. The ceasefire itself deserves careful examination, because the word ceasefire is doing an enormous amount of diplomatic work right now that the actual facts on the ground do not fully support. What exists is not a formal ceasefire agreement with defined terms, verification mechanisms, a timeline, and agreed consequences for violations. What exists is a set of parallel unilateral declarations, a fragile operational pause that both sides have chosen to maintain for reasons that are rooted more in their respective assessments of what they can afford to do right now than in any shared commitment to the principle of de-escalation. The United States has 3 carrier strike groups positioned in the waters surrounding the Persian Gulf theater. Israel has continued intelligence operations and has maintained its posture in Lebanon. Iran has the Strait of Hormuz mined and its military on high alert. None of these are the postures of parties that have genuinely stepped back from the edge. They are the postures of parties that have temporarily stopped shooting while they assess their options and try to extract maximum concessions from the pause. The ceasefire is hanging by a thread, not because the thread is fraying randomly. It is hanging by a thread because both sides are deliberately keeping it thin enough to cut at the moment that cutting it serves their purposes. Now let us talk about what Iran's military alert actually means for the IRGC's internal political situation, because this is the dimension that most Western coverage is systematically missing. The IRGC is not simply a military organization that has been placed on alert by political leaders who made a strategic calculation. The IRGC is itself a political actor, possibly the most powerful political actor currently operating inside the Islamic Republic, and its decision to activate high alert status carries internal political meaning that is inseparable from its external military meaning. The IRGC Military Council that has been running Iranian foreign policy for the past several months, the same council that removed the parliament speaker from the negotiating table for trying to negotiate, that vetoed every cabinet appointment the elected president attempted to make, that authored the maximalist 14-point peace proposal that Washington rejected within hours, has staked its entire internal political position on a single core argument. That argument is that Iran can survive this confrontation through resistance, that the strategy of maximum pressure, maximum resistance, refusing every compromise that would credit the civilian government with delivering relief is sustainable, that America will eventually find the cost of continued confrontation unacceptable. The high alert order reinforces that argument internally. It tells the Iranian power centers that are watching the IRGC's management of this crisis that the guards are not backing down, that they have not been intimidated by the American naval strike or the Israeli bombing of Beirut, and that the posture of absolute resistance remains in place. But it also creates a trap, because the logic of that posture, the internal political necessity of demonstrating that the IRGC cannot be intimidated, is now in direct tension with the external strategic reality that an actual kinetic response to the American naval strike could trigger a level of American military action that the IRGC's operational infrastructure cannot survive. This is the contradiction at the heart of Iran's current position. The political logic of the IRGC's internal power structure pushes toward escalation because de-escalation looks like capitulation, and capitulation destroys the political legitimacy on which IRGC power rests. But the military logic of the actual balance of forces in the Gulf pushes toward restraint because the United States has 3 carrier groups in the water and has already demonstrated its willingness to use them. Managing that contradiction is the central challenge facing whoever is actually making decisions inside Tehran right now, and the difficulty of that management task is made significantly worse by the fact that the civilian government, which might theoretically provide a political exit ramp that allowed de-escalation without the appearance of military capitulation, has been systematically stripped of the authority and credibility it would need to perform that function. President Pezeshkian cannot offer the world a compromise that the IRGC will enforce, because the IRGC has spent months demonstrating that it does not enforce presidential decisions it disagrees with. So the exit ramp does not exist in the form that would normally exist in a state with functioning civilian governance. The only actors who can decide whether Iran de-escalates or escalates are the same actors whose internal political logic pushes toward escalation. That is the structural trap that the current moment has produced. Now let us look at the American side of this equation, because the picture in Washington is more complicated than the public posture of firm resolve suggests. The United States struck an Iranian vessel. It has maintained 3 carrier groups in position. It has conducted military briefings on options for a short and powerful new wave of strikes against Iranian targets. All of that is real, and all of it reflects a genuine American willingness to use military force if the situation requires it. But the American diplomatic track has not been abandoned. The back channels through Pakistan and Oman are still technically open. The Trump administration has not publicly declared that negotiations are over. It is conducting kinetic operations and diplomatic outreach simultaneously, which is a posture that carries its own internal tensions and contradictions. The problem with running both tracks simultaneously is the signaling problem it creates. If you strike an Iranian vessel while keeping the diplomatic channels open, you are telling Tehran that you're willing to fight and negotiate at the same time, which means the price of any deal keeps rising because every American military action raises the bar for what Iran feels it must demand in return to maintain internal credibility. And every Iranian high alert order raises the American domestic political pressure to maintain or increase the military posture, which makes the diplomatic concessions that might actually produce a deal harder to offer publicly. The Strait of Hormuz remains the physical center of this crisis, and it deserves specific attention because the situation in the strait is considerably more complex than the simple binary of open or closed that most coverage presents. The strait is technically closed in the sense that major commercial shipping companies have suspended normal transit operations. The world's largest container lines have not resumed service through Hormuz. Insurance premiums for vessels that do attempt transit remain at levels that make most commercial operations economically unviable. Tanker traffic is a fraction of its pre-crisis volume, but the strait is not closed in the sense of being physically impassable to all vessels. Some traffic continues. Military vessels from multiple nations are operating in the area. The question of what constitutes open versus closed in this context is partly operational and partly political, and the answer changes depending on who is asking and what their interests are. What is not in dispute is that the economic consequences of the current situation are severe and are compounding with each day that passes. Brent crude is trading above $111 a barrel. Global supply chains are being rerouted at enormous cost. The inflationary pressure that the prolonged Strait disruption is generating is being absorbed by economies that are already operating under stress from the previous years of economic turbulence. Every day, the Strait remains. In its current status is another day of economic damage that will take years to fully repair. There is a detail about the Strait's current status that has received almost no attention in mainstream coverage, and that may be the single most consequential physical fact in this entire crisis. Iranian naval forces laid sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz as part of the initial closure operation. Those mines were deployed as a weapon of strategic leverage, a way of making the cost of forcibly reopening the strait high enough to deter American and Allied naval action. But the mining operation was conducted under wartime conditions, with the speed and urgency that wartime conditions impose, and Iranian naval commanders have subsequently been unable to account fully for the location of all the mines they deployed. This is not a minor operational detail. This means that even if a ceasefire agreement were reached tomorrow, even if Iran agreed to reopen the strait, and the United States agreed to lift the naval blockade and both sides committed to a verified implementation process, the strait could not be physically reopened immediately. The mines would need to be located and cleared, a process that takes time, specialized equipment, and a level of operational cooperation between adversarial naval forces that does not currently exist and would need to be negotiated as part of any settlement framework. The weapon that Iran deployed to create leverage has also created a physical obstacle to the resolution that leverage was supposed to produce. The threat became the trap. And understanding that trap is essential to understanding why any ceasefire agreement that gets reached in the coming days or weeks will be followed by a period of dangerous uncertainty during which the strait will not immediately return to normal operational status, even if all the political conditions for its reopening are met. Let us now look at the ceasefire negotiations themselves, because the process by which this standoff might be resolved is as important as the substantive terms of any agreement, and the process is currently broken in ways that are not being clearly communicated in public reporting. The fundamental problem with the current negotiating architecture is that the parties who are actually making military decisions on the Iranian side are not the parties who are participating in the diplomatic process. Iran's foreign minister, Araghchi, has been the face of Iranian diplomacy in the back, channel communications through Pakistani and Omani intermediaries. But as has been documented in detail by Iran, international citing informed sources, Araghchi has been operating not under presidential direction, but under IRGC direction. He answers to General Vahidi, not to President Pezeshkian. This means that the diplomatic signals coming from Iranian foreign ministry channels are not necessarily an accurate reflection of the decisions being made by the people who actually control Iran's military posture. It means that concessions agreed to by the diplomatic channel may not be implemented by the military channel. And it means that any agreement reached through the current negotiating architecture carries a fundamental verification problem that goes beyond the normal challenges of arms control verification. The question is not just whether Iran will comply with an agreement. The question is whether the people who sign the agreement have the authority to compel compliance from the people who control the weapons. Washington understands this problem. U.S. officials have repeatedly noted in background briefings that the fundamental challenge in negotiating with Iran is identifying who actually speaks with binding authority for the decisions that matter. The assessment that Galibaf, when he was still heading the Iranian negotiating team, was well positioned to deliver on agreements was based on his dual background in the IRGC and civilian governance. His removal from that role by IRGC pressure was not just a diplomatic setback. It was the elimination of the one figure in Iran's current power structure who might have been able to bridge the gap between the diplomatic channel and the military decision-making channel. What replaced him potentially in the form of Saeed. Jalili's faction is a hardline political tendency that has built its entire identity on the principle that negotiating with America is national surrender. You cannot reach a durable agreement with a negotiating partner whose core political identity is rooted in the conviction that any agreement constitutes defeat. Here's what the next 72 hours actually look like from an analytical standpoint. The Iranian military alert creates a specific decision window. High alert status cannot be maintained indefinitely without imposing severe operational strain on the forces involved and without creating domestic economic costs that compound on top of the economic devastation the country is already experiencing. Iran will need to either act on the alert, converting it from a signal into a kinetic response, or stand down the alert in a way that is managed carefully, enough to avoid looking like a retreat. The ceasefire creates a parallel decision window. Every hour the ceasefire holds without either side converting the pause into a genuine negotiating process, the domestic pressure on both sides to demonstrate that the pause is being used productively increases. And the Iranian economic situation creates a third decision window that is compressing faster than either of the first two. Senior Iranian economic officials have reportedly told President Pezeshkian privately that the economy cannot sustain the current conditions for much longer without crossing into a territory of collapse from which recovery would take more than a decade. The President of the Islamic Republic has been told by his own economic advisors that the country is approaching the edge of an economic cliff. And he is being told this by advisors who know that the President does not have the authority to pull the country back from that edge, because the people who do have that authority are the same people who put the country in this position. The military alert, the ceasefire thread, and the economic clock are now running simultaneously on May 12, 2026. Each one creates pressure. Each one interacts with the others. And the combination of all three is producing the most dangerous and most unstable moment in this crisis since the initial closure of the Strait of Hormuz in late February. Watch the operational patterns of IRGC naval assets in the coming hours. Watch whether fast attack craft return to normal patrol configurations or remain in pre-engagement positioning. Watch whether Iranian proxy networks in Iraq, Yemen, and Syria receive activation signals or remain at their current operational tempo. Watch whether the Pakistani and Omani diplomatic channels produce any movement in the substantive terms being discussed, or whether they continue to exchange the same maximalist positions that have characterized the negotiations for weeks. And watch the Iranian domestic economic indicators, because the pressure that is building inside Iran's economy right now is the pressure that will ultimately force a decision from the people who are currently refusing to make one. Here's the bottom line. The ceasefire is hanging by a thread because the thread is being held by people on the Iranian side whose political survival depends on not appearing to need the ceasefire, and by people on the American side whose domestic political position requires demonstrating that the ceasefire reflects Iranian accommodation rather than American compromise. Both sides need the ceasefire to survive for different reasons. Both sides are behaving in ways that make the ceasefire harder to sustain. That is the definition of a situation in which accidents and miscalculations carry outsized consequences. The Iranian high alert is not a declaration of war. It is a signal. But signals in a crisis environment with this much military hardware in close proximity, with this much economic pressure on one side, with this much domestic political constraint on both sides, can be misread. And misread signals at the highest military alert level are how ceasefires end without anyone having made a deliberate decision to end them. The thread is thin. The forces pulling at it from both ends are real. And everyone watching this situation from the outside, every government in Asia and Europe and the Gulf that has enormous stakes in what happens next in the Strait of Hormuz, is holding its breath and hoping that the 11-minute phone call was the beginning of something rather than the end of it. This crisis since the initial closure of the Strait of Hormuz in late February. Watch the operational patterns of IRGC naval assets in the coming hours. Watch whether fast attack craft return to normal patrol configurations or remain in pre-engagement positioning. Watch whether Iranian proxy networks in Iraq, Yemen, and Syria receive activation signals or remain at their current operational tempo. Watch whether the Pakistani and Omani diplomatic channels produce any movement in the substantive terms being discussed, or whether they continue to exchange the same maximalist positions that have characterized the negotiations for weeks. And watch the Iranian domestic economic indicators, because the pressure that is building inside Iran's economy right now is the pressure that will ultimately force a decision from the people who are currently refusing to make one. Here's the bottom line. The ceasefire is hanging by a thread because the thread is being held by people on the Iranian side whose political survival depends on not appearing to need the ceasefire, and by people on the American side whose domestic political position requires demonstrating that the ceasefire reflects Iranian accommodation rather than American compromise. Both sides need the ceasefire to survive for different reasons. Both sides are behaving in ways that make the ceasefire harder to sustain. That is the definition of a situation in which accidents and miscalculations carry outsized consequences. The Iranian high alert is not a declaration of war. It is a signal. But signals in a crisis environment with this much military hardware in close proximity, with this much economic pressure on one side, with this much domestic political constraint on both sides, can be misread. And misread signals at the highest military alert level are how ceasefires end without anyone having made a deliberate decision to end them. The thread is thin. The forces pulling at it from both ends are real. And everyone watching this situation from the outside, Every government in Asia and Europe and the Gulf that has enormous stakes in what happens next in the Strait of Hormuz is holding its breath and hoping that the 11-minute phone call was the beginning of something rather than the end of it.